Namaste and in Lak'ech, and welcome to this edition of One World in a New World. I'm your host, Zen Benefiel, and I just want to reiterate the possibilities that exist with those two phrases. Namaste comes from the Sanskrit, which means that which is in me recognizes that which is in you, and in Lak'ech comes from the Mayan, which means I am another you. So imagine if we could see others from that perspective, what kind of a difference it would make in our lives together, especially now. Great. So this week's guest is Dr. Pauline Crawford, who's this really wonderful conversation maker. And she facilitates narratives for best synergy and leadership and mind flow, which is a cool term, in regeneration, men and women together working on gender, abilities to be together. And she is the Chief Vision Officer for Corporate Heart International. She's the Chief Culture Officer for My CEO and creating magical conversations in crisis. Then she's also a global ambassador of magical conversations and gender dynamics as a wellness transformer and for Corporate Heart. She's president of the World Association of Visionaries and Entrepreneurs. Let's have a wave for that. And we'll get into some other things about you, Pauline. So glad to have you here. Thank you for joining us.
Well, it's absolutely my magical pleasure to be here, Zen. It's just wonderful sitting in my lighthouse as I am, gazing at you on your wonderful view of the
cosmos. I'm sitting on the moon with the earth in the background. It reminds me of the Sting tune, right? Walking on the moon. No, I'm just sitting for now. Thank you. It's still focusing on the planet that we sorely need to acknowledge and be part of, because without her, we can't be.
Absolutely. And I think that's what's beautiful about this cosmos that we live in, the planet and the whole of the universe. It comes together. It's synergistic. It's one of my passions, is to understand how all the pieces work together, especially human beings, as you pointed out.
Absolutely. Now, when you
everywhere in the world.
And we're hoping that it does spread, it becomes ubiquitous, or at least a new level of understanding come available. Now, just so we can get an idea of the process that you went through, because it's all about process, rites of passage, and things that we can correlate, corroborate, and have congruent and consistent that we share, right? So in your early days, whenever that was, what brought you to the awareness that there's more and that you can be a part of it, and there's things that need to be done to that effect?
Well, my passion is conversations, magical conversations. But when I look back across my life and many decades, I was always at the center of communication and connection and conversation. So whether that was when I was a kid in my family, which was very prevalent in the British community of having tea parties, and there'd be lots of people, and there'd be lots of people talking. When I was at school, I was always a good conduit of communication and connection.
And the adults probably thought you were a precocious little girl too.
Well, yes. But what I noticed, and this I think is where the magic came on, I would observe when I was a sort of 10, 12-year-old kind of listening to uncles and aunts, that there were certain conversations that flowed, and certain times the conversation would get stuck because somebody would pontificate. There was a particular uncle who would always say, well, I think, and then you knew that. And as a child, I was listening to this energy flow, and I thought, oh, and I got the idea that when you allowed energy to flow, the conversation came in and out and round, and it wasn't polarized by one person.
Right. And James Redfield gets into that in his book, Celestine Prophecy. I think it's the third insight.
Yes.
Where, the practice is to sit still until you feel like you need to say something, and not until.
Absolutely. And one of the things I discovered in my journey of understanding these conversations, this was when I became a more enlightened person in my kind of mid-30s, 40s, when I started realizing that the spirit was taking me other places. I worked with this concept, which became magical conversations, but we called it the third space. And it's still a very relevant concept, that the space between us as human beings is a space in which we become magical together. It's when
That's kind of like a neutral third party, right?
It is, because when we when we go in with our ego and we only talk from our ego, we don't sense the energy which is coming into that third space. And that's why I say now a magical conversation space is a space of no judgment. And people find that very hard because they go, how do I become not judgmental? I say, well, it's a practice.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I had a dear friend that's on the other side now. He actually was written up in Time magazine as being a prophet of his own time. He helped start the waterbed industry. But he had told me one time, there's no ego without wego.
Yes.
And so the ego, it's not bad, it's good that we have them. However, it's how we align them that makes the difference. And it can either be self-centered or open to be collaborative centered, or in the mind flow state as opposed to the mindset as you use.
And this is really important, this mind flow, because we do need to know our own ego. We need to know who we are. We need to be able to understand other people, but it's a flow.
And you've got some others that are needing to know too.
It's a value creation. If I know myself and I get to know you, we become a we.
Absolutely.
And the we benefits me as an individual and you as an individual. And when you multiply that out to groups and communities, we have to keep on organizing this flow in our mind flow and our heart flow. Mm-hmm. And then our wealth flow comes from that flow.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you, and have proven that to some degree in my own life, because that's what I needed to do in order to make it all come true, right? Because we have to test the truth. And if we don't, we can't expect it to come forth, which means faith, love, and trust in a lot of places, right? So how, in these conversations, how do you notice the disconnects, and what do you do with them when they come up in order to nurture them to someplace new?
Well, this is a really good question. And my guidelines are no judgment, no anger, no coercion. So this is a guideline for a magical conversation. Mm-hmm. And people say to me, but what if I'm really, I'm so driven and I'm going to be polarizing I said, well, it's not a magical conversation. It's another conversation. It's a debate, an argument. Right. God knows what it is. But in the magical conversation, you're coming from your experience, and that's how you move past judgment. You're not even giving your opinion. So I invite people, it's quite gestalt. In my experience of this topic, which is in the center of this conversation, and I share what it is I believe, it's then that I must be willing to listen. And I might not necessarily like everything that's being said into this space, but the listening of it and the observing different perspectives is part of it. So there are two things that help this. It's one, I guide people to understand what kind of men and women they are. And I designed a gender dynamics intelligence to help us, but we could be using any form of understanding about human behavior, human differences, being, if you like, having that common sense when you enter the circle. But it is a circle, it's a wisdom circle, whether it's on Zoom or it's in a room or it's only between.
It's in the circle where you make sense common.
You make sense common. And as the droplets of wisdom enter the center, you let go of your experience and you listen to somebody else's experience. Now, if somebody is angry, and I often get asked this, but what if? And I say, well,
sure.
What if they are? Then it's around the facilitator, who's not there to lead this session, but to observe if that happens, is to remind that person very calmly and gently, it's great to have you here and have your views heard, but this is a space of no judgment, no anger, no coercion. we'd love you to stay, but you would need to observe those. Would you like to stay or would you like to leave? And because you do that in a very caring way and nobody jumps in to hit anybody.
Right, right.
I find most
you
people
set the space for it to happen, and oftentimes it brings up another wise mentor of mine, a black belt Aikido instructor, was president of the Association for Alternate Dispute Resolution. He says there really is no conflict. There's just miscommunication. We come to the table with different dictionaries and we don't understand the other person's dictionary. So what you're describing to me is the process of understanding the other person's dictionary in a polite and conversant, caring, maybe even compassionate way, because you're just listening and you're doing your best just to listen.
Absolutely. And I found in my experience that 99.9% of the time, that person will say, oh no, I'd like to stay. And because nobody is going sneering or doing anything, everybody is holding that space. They have a huge lesson just in that moment, irregardless of their content.
Isn't it amazing how, we talk about quantum physics and linearity and nonlinearity and non-locality and all those kinds of things. And that's a perfect example of it.
Yes.
When something just happens in an instant and it connects on every level, right?
Well, that's right. And I think your passion and my passion is creating, a new world, a unified world where difference is allowed, to respecting differences and knowing that we're equal but different.
Yeah, embracing them and aligning them. It doesn't change the nature of the division of labor, the things that need to be done. What it does do is it changes the attitude with which we do them.
Absolutely. And there's so much talk about inclusion, embracing everybody, but I think it's not done from the heart sometimes. If you only do it from the head, inclusion doesn't work very well.
Right.
This idea of not making assumptions, which we all do, and we will be judgmental, but in that space, in that time, you're not. And you're not trying to act on anything that said. This is another thing that the world of traditional business finds very difficult. They go, but what about KPIs? And what about action? I said, that's later. What you're doing is you're seeding creative wisdom.
Right. You got to slow down to move fast.
Absolutely.
And by doing that, it diminishes the entropy.
Yes. And my vision and dream is that just by learning that technique, we can start bridging the divide, because we do have a divide. We have a divide on so many issues at the moment, whether it's race or sexual orientation or whatever it is, generation. And we're not going to get a better future if we keep on dividing and dividing.
Right.
So that statement, was it unified we grow, united we fall? I can't remember. Divided we store.
Right. A house divided cannot stand is, I think, with Ben Franklin, right, or somebody like that. That's the unified field, so to speak, is ever present. It's acquiescing to that, which is what your process at least opens the door for. And from what I heard you saying, that feeling, right, of which, and even mentioning Redfield's work, it goes back to the ancient indigenous philosophy of the three brains, the gut, the heart, and the head, and that we feel things first. So this is kind of where Redfield thinks, yes. You have to sit with it. You have to feel the movement in order to participate in it. And it's a 1, 2, 3, as opposed to the reverse, which is what we tend to do because we have no training in the other. We have no permission to be emotive.
Yes. And permission is a very important word, because I think we, in the traditional old world that we're leaving, where it was so, you've got to make money, you've got to be profitable, you've got to hit your targets, you've got to go up a grade. It's all fixed.
And all metric driven.
Yeah. And it's not allowing for creativity. Our school system doesn't, our corporate world doesn't. And yet being creative is what human beings are all about. We are born to be creative.
Well, Sergey brought this out in his fifth discipline, in the, you know, the ubiquitousness that it got in the corporate world with self-mastery, learning organizations, but you first had to have self-mastery. Well, that's what we're talking about, is that aspect of self-mastery. So the seeds have been there since the 90s. Now,
yeah.
they've been there longer than that, right? But at least in the corporate world, it's been there since that time. So it kind of gave the cultural creatives the opportunity to embrace this awareness that they already had. It just gave them definable terms to use.
Absolutely. And one of the things I'm very passionate about is really getting people to understand their natural gifts, that which they were born with, which they never learned at school. I learned other things at school, but we've all have a gift. And most of the time, like Sir Ken Robinson used to talk about, you know, it's been wiped out by parenting or siblings or schooling. And often people say to me, oh, I don't know what my natural gift is. I said, it's what you do naturally. And usually you give it away. And people will say, oh, you do that really well. And you'll go, oh, no, not that. I said, that is your natural gift.
Yeah.
So that rediscovery and exploration, I feel like Star Trek sometimes, you know, we're going into the unknown, but we don't need to.
We've never been here before, and yet that's our natural place. You know, I asked one of my guests recently, what do you think about the process of this natural design that's within each of us that's now emerging?
Yeah.
And he sat back, and it was a stumper, right? He said, you know, I never thought about that. Well, it seems to me common sense. If you look at the science and the spirituality perspectives, right, and how they merge, this would only seem to be a natural order. We call it a new world order because we've never had it before, right? But it's this natural order that's emerging. Even as you and I speak right now, we're finding this place of harmony that we're resonating, and we're having a conversation about all the different aspects of it and how it's co-created with others in the processes in order to be able to do that, or at least one that you found works really good for you.
Right? Yes. And I think the other thing we often forget in this materialistic world that we created in the centuries is that nature does it naturally. So, you know, I know we help nature as well, but, you know, I've got lots of trees outside here, and they all grow differently, and they all grow naturally, and they all have different names, but they're all trees. And it's all about respecting the differences that nature brings us.
Well, and we don't even think about the mycelium.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the substrate in the soil that allows all of those plants to communicate with each other. Now, that's something that we have as a sense. We might call it telepathy. We might, you know, use one of the clairaudience, clairvoyance, clairsentience, you know, all that kind of stuff. Only your hairdresser knows, right? So these kind of aspects are things, this unknown that we haven't experienced yet. And if you're used to being in a patriarchal, metric-driven, empirical world, it just doesn't make sense to begin with.
No.
Until you begin allowing yourself to have a direct experience of it. Now, and I believe this is what you do. So how do you create that scenario? How do you prep people other than the basic parameters? Right? Because I know you well enough already just in this short time that you don't just leave it at that.
Well, one of the things I think it's important to get people to answer something which comes from their heart. So the recent wisdom circle, we said, you know, what is the one word for your future? So when you ask somebody, what's your one word for the future? It's personal. It's not to do with their ego. It's to do with their value system and their heart.
Right.
So it puts them in a different space to be there. And when I gather people together, I don't get them to introduce themselves by their title or whatever. It's more about how are you being? You know, what's your one word for the future? What's your superpower, as our friend Lisa Marr would say. But it's making a difference. In a physical environment, I have often used archetype cards or angel cards or anything, because
Right.
all you're doing is you're shifting people's.
Oh, but that's fluffy stuff.
Yeah, but it's their sense of who they are.
I mean, that's the normal left brain response.
Oh, yes.
Right.
And the thing is, I think the other thing is, and I was just writing a proposal for somebody who wants me to go into a fairly tricky situation and bring this circle together over, one of our key tricky topics about racism. So it's saying to people, are you willing to be here before you're here? I mean, you may not know what it is, you're coming into the circle, it's the unknown, but the willingness to find a unified solution can be preset by literally asking them. And I even did this on a video intro. I said, if you're a cynic, but you're willing, I don't mind you coming along. If you're a spectator and you're not really get into it, maybe don't bother.
Right.
I mean, I think we have to understand that we're all at different levels of conversation. So it's not excluding anybody, but it's attracting them to the space that they want to be in.
Right. And understanding that I've been a teacher, I do partnering workshops for road and bridge construction. I'm a transformational life coach and all kinds of host, right? So I need to be aware of the multiple levels of intelligence, background, experience, and just allow that to be present. Which brings me to the question you asked earlier, what's your superpower? I got asked that on an interview one time. I'd never thought about it. First came out of my mouth without hesitation, vulnerability.
Yeah.
Because that's, to me, the state of being.
Yes.
In order to be available.
Well, it is. And it's every single word that everybody said on that particular session, from vulnerability to hope to innovation to abundance, each one of those could be the topic of a magical conversation.
Oh, absolutely.
Every single one of us will have a different experience of that. So these are multiple layers of understanding. So I understand more about you because you say vulnerability. I don't know what it means to you, but it means something to me. So then we can explore. So what's the experience?
Well, yeah, that's where active listening comes in, right?
Yeah.
Where you say, I think what you said was, and this is my understanding of what you just said. And so how do we, is this part of the practice that you engage as well? Is that
I do, and
part of it.
Some of the gatherings, like I've got a World Wisdom Circle coming together, which you've come to. That's free gratis. It's gathering energy from every part of the world to find out how different cultures see the same word. But I do these engagements in the corporate world and the business world, and they're designed to help bridge the divide. So especially if there's some niggle, something going wrong, something, the whole department's just not functioning, there's other work that you can do to lead into the magical conversation, but you're moving people into that awareness so they can sit around the table and get to the point when they understand, hey, we want our culture to be different.
Right.
So let's put our distresses outside the door and just enter this table about how we work together, for instance. That's the classic one at the moment. How do we collaborate, or how do we understand diversity, or what's leadership? So you can put any of those topics in the center, and those are constructed engagements in my business world.
Sure. Kind of like De Bono's 6 hats.
Sorry?
Right. It's kind of like De Bono's 6 hats.
And interesting you should mention him. He's actually a cousin of mine.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah. Wonderful.
A third cousin of my Maltese family. But it's important because he was very instrumental in my childhood, because I loved all the lateral thinking games that he would put out before he did the 6
lateral
hats.
thinking, and who was it that came out with the fuzzy logic? and there was Tom Crum about managing chaos, and all of these things were indicators of moving away. Let me ask you this. Do you preface the conversation with something like, well, there's a place where we're all one. Let's see if we can uncover that.
Well, I haven't used those actual words, but yes, that intention of
Okay.
synergy and unify. And I'm just writing that literally today. It's like, if we're going to bridge the divide, whatever that divide is, whether it's men and women because there aren't enough women in the workplace, or it's about race, or something that there's a divide, it's about unifying and understanding, respecting differences. So there's that pathway to unification without losing what is beautiful and brilliant about us as individuals.
Yeah, the unification without losing the differentiation, right, or the diversity. And as I said before, there's no need for completely revamping any kind of division of labor and things like that, because pretty much everybody's in place that needs to be in order for us to have an ongoing society. We're not necessarily thriving yet because we're in the middle of chaos, and I love your use of that, the challenge, harmonize, attract, optimize, and synergize, right? That's a much better acronym for chaos, and yet within chaos there is order. We just don't know how to find it yet.
Well, I think in my experience of people who have been stuck in the old ways of control and command, not necessarily by them, but by their external field.
Sure.
They're not sure how to be in this mind flow because they've been so conditioned to have a mindset.
It's totally unfamiliar, and they're not comfortable with having choice.
Oh, absolutely. And uncertainty, which is joyful.
Ambiguity is a big one for discussion now. Is, you got to be in the agility, in the business agility today, there has to be a comfort with ambiguity. Because we don't know. We got to figure it out. I don't know. Let's try it. Find out. Right?
Well, I do think that's one of our greatest challenges, that when we say we've all got to be unified, there's not an implication for me that we have to be the same.
Absolutely.
It's like the equality agenda, which I have great challenges with my own gender, because I say, we're equal and different. So yes, equality, but not sameness.
Right.
We're not the same as men, and we're not the same as each other as sisters or brothers. We're not the same as each other in generations or cultures. So respect differences.
Sure.
In order to get this beautiful, it's
tapestry, kind of. Mix. It's like we're all a thread in the tapestry. And now, let me ask you this: in the comment earlier about the natural order, right, that we all kind of fit into, that's there before we even recognize it, because that's just the way it is. It's kind of a Zen thing, right? Well, it's the unified field without distraction. And so in that, is it possible, and I've often thought about this, and I know it's way out there, but from a frequency response standpoint, and in quantum, the realms of quantum physics being based on vibration, and of course you can't think your way through a system built on vibration. You have to sense your way through it. Knowing that, what I come up with is this notion that we have a perfected form, fit, and function in the world that we can acquiesce to, and we don't necessarily have to change who we are to do that. It just activates our skill set in the way that it was designed. Does that ring true?
I think it is, and it's something, because I'm what I would call a masculine-minded female. Because I'm a mathematician, I'm very logical. I have to go back into my senses to trust again, some days when I get stuck in here thinking too logically, that actually everything is flowing in a vibration if I let go, and then the signs turn up. Now, for some people, that's going to sound like spooky.
Well, it's spooky action at a distance, right?
But I think it's like when something feels good, just very simply.
Absolutely.
And just go with that feeling. Does this feel good, or does it feel stuck, or does it feel rich? And again, going back to this idea, it's either contraction or expansion. And that's all you need to say. Is this contracting and making me feel less than, even though I can't find the words to describe what I'm trying to say? Then just let go back into your sense of expansion, and you'll find that the answer will come maybe later.
Right.
But I think sometimes
it will come.
say, you know, that will make me sound stupid, because if I can't remember how to do it then I say, no, that's your choice.
Yeah. I can't make you feel anyway. It's your choice as to how you feel.
Yes.
In those feelings, though, how do you see the process of being able to tap into that understanding and be able to take a person from that uncomfortable place? And you mentioned the dichotomy of sensations. Another dear friend, Kai D, that name may be familiar. He was the original WOFAT on Hawaii 5-0. He also had a doctorate in theology. He was the rector for a Taoist sanctuary here in Tempe, Arizona, and I got to meet him, and he was one of my guests on my first One World 30 years ago. But he, being a Taoist, he also wrote a great book called The 11th Wing, which was all about the Tao.
Oh,
and
yes.
so what he said to me, though, was just so crystal clear and obvious. It's either desirable or undesirable.
Yes.
And you know the distinction between those two. You feel it. There's no words, there's no thoughts, there's nothing else. It's just a feeling.
And that feeling, as you said, is a vibration.
Right.
So if we see everything in the world as energy, one of the things I talk about is there are energy angels and there are energy vampires around us. So that, you know, the vampires are the ones who just take you down, and the angels are the ones that lift you up. But it's your choice as to how you receive those things.
Who you spend time with.
Who you spend time with, and the practice of the words that you use. So, you know, if you get really stuck, you might just say, well, that's a really interesting point of view.
Right. Well, there's also a meme I've seen in many places, and of course I love Sheldrake's work with the memes and creodes, right? However, the words cast spells.
Oh, yes.
Right? We don't realize, because they're vibrations, that what we speak ultimately, if we're not careful, will manifest. So if we're talking about stuff we don't like, or fears that we have, or anything, and we're just, you know, flapping our mouths about this stuff and not really thinking about how we're programming our reality by doing so,
Yes.
and then we wonder why those things manifest.
Yes. Yes. And then when you get the collective energy of people using high energy words, love, intention, trust, respect, compassion, you know, and the more we use these words and the less we get into this, well, that's right and that's wrong, and you know, you can see all those vampire words. And my dream is that we can actually remove the vampire words, because we still got a lot of things to sort out, even if we get to having a lot of energy angels together.
Absolutely.
There are certain things happening with our planet that, you know, we still need to take attention to. You know,
as water babies, right?
Water babies, yes.
As water babies, because that's basically what we are. Have you incorporated any of Masaru Emoto's work as evidence for what thoughts can do?
I haven't, but I think that would be a very good idea. Well, one of the things I've been doing over the last year with my international group, which we were doing a lot of work on how do men and women see things different, and creating a new compendium of words. So we could then actually test out the words that different characters like to use. So we're not ignoring every word that we don't like. We're saying, oh yes, there's certain characters who will use more I tell you, and some will say I ask you, some will say I share, some, but all those words are okay.
It's the making up of new words, and you know,
up of new
love
words.
to do that. That my mother being.
Yeah, I need your help on this. We need to make a word matrix compendium of ways to say things that enhance our relationships with other people by understanding where they're coming from, as well as where we're coming from. So it's that value creation cycle.
That sounds fascinating. I would love that.
Yeah.
So you just hooked me. Right?
Yeah. Well, it's like, and I take you in.
It was a soft hook. It was desirable.
If it's desirable. Because it's all about interpretation. And when people react negatively or kind of you feel them flinch at a word that you think is positive, it's important to ask them, so where does that sit in your compendium?
Different dictionary.
Yeah.
Right. There's a trigger word for them, and it may be a warm, fuzzy word for you.
Yeah. And that's okay too. And I think the more we can have that as common parlance in business and life. And I'll give you just a quick example. I was working in Malaysia with a Malaysian mixed community. And this young man was saying that he really appreciated his wife. And he didn't think men were slow on appreciation. And all the women in the room were sort of going, oh, yes. Anyway, I asked a very simple question. I said, I get that you really do appreciate your wife, but give me a scenario. What happens? So he said, well, I come back from, I come back from work and she's come back from work and she's cooking and she's looking after the kids. So I leave her alone. But I really appreciate her. So I said, oh, does she know this? And he said, it was as this sort of dawned on him that everything he thought was internal and he hadn't actually expressed it.
Right.
He realized what the bridge was.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and we often do that. We think others ought to know.
Yes.
Well, how do they, some people may, because they may have a greater degree of sensitivity and understanding and their own personal growth. However, the majority of us really need to hear that. We need to have the interaction, the acknowledgement, the compassion and understanding that, you are appreciated, you are loved, and whether it's, the look, the touch, the words, something in the outer world that reflects what's going on inside.
Yeah, the women in general, and these are generalizations, but in my experience of women, they need to hear things more often than men do. So being appreciated, a man will say it once, but she might want it 10 times. And he might say, well, that's too excessive. I said, well, it depends if you're standing in her shoes or in your shoes.
And there's a degree of authenticity that needs to come along with it too, because that's a feeling level too. Whether it's meant or not. Now, here's the other thing that I find, and I'll ask you this: is the listening always there to hear the authenticity?
Oh yes.
Is it, or is it filtered through what they're expecting or their own personal beliefs or whatever mood they're in?
I think
that goes for men and women both.
Both men and women. There's definitely filters that come from our current emotional state and the pressures around us, whether we can listen, maybe when the kids are screaming or we don't hear something, we need it 10 times. Other times we go, oh yeah, that's fine, just once. Right. But it's all about being alert to the possibility that we haven't been heard and to checking. I had a wonderful client of mine who was a teacher, and he said, every day I go back into school having thought about the conversations from the day before, and I will go and just address those individuals, say, we had this conversation yesterday. Was it all resolved to your degree of satisfaction? And if they say yes, it's a bonus. If they say, well, no, actually there was this, then he can resolve it. But it's taking the time to check in.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that and apply that as often as possible. And yet it can be aggravating to others that I've experienced, because they're in that hurry up, I got to get it done mode, right? I don't have time for this right now.
Yeah, that's where some of the understanding that I've gleaned about different types of men and women comes into my work, because we've developed this matrix of archetypes. So we can get a little bit of an idea when people are sitting in their masculine energy or feminine energy within both male and female. And that's a learned thing. So it's like in our families, you know, if we know our families well and we all love each other, we'll know, oh yeah, my sister's different to me, or my brother's this, or I'll just do that with him. There's an unconscious awareness when we're close to people, our family or colleagues or friends. But if we can learn certain, to identify certain signs, even in the business world, then we can adjust our awareness to have those conversations, to draw them in to the flow.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be in that moment. Although if it can be, that's best. But oftentimes it has to be tabled for another opportunity, or even I've had questions sometimes where it's like, okay, I know there's some tension here. I need to resolve it somehow. And I ask for an opening.
Yes.
And I wait. And it always happens. It's just like clockwork, right? You really never know when it's going to be, but when it happens, you have that sense, oh yeah, this is desirable, right?
Well, that's right. And in getting to know you, Zen, I would say that of my male archetypes, you're my philosopher. You're a thinking, feeling, intuitive male. But there are some men, and you know them, who are very, okay, come on, get down to action. What is it? Do it now.
Oh yeah.
I can't be doing with all this chatter. And similarly with women, there are different types of women. So it's not that everybody can direct the conversation only their way, but by understanding these differences, we can allow the conversation to flow depending on what the situation is. So if it's a serious meeting or it's a fun meeting, the same characteristics can be used to maximize the frequency.
Well, you prompted. I'm sorry. I did. No, I'm not sorry. I'm Zen still. The aspect of the team, right, where you may have a philosopher, you may have a technician, an agnostic, a questioner, all of these different archetypes that you have. Now, is it essential to be aware of those, and are there simple ways of seeing or observing the body language, words, eye contact, those kinds of things that kind of reveal that person? I know good body readers and you know, the folks that's practice NLP a lot and or just the practice of observing people over years, like, you know, you get to be our age and you've been doing it a while, right?
Well, they are, and I think that there are subtleties to this process and simplicities, but there is physicality, and I look at the actual body structure. So this is an unusual part of my assessment, the actual, not our flesh weight, but our bone structure. It can create a stance and a flow of body that can be more masculine or more feminine within men and women.
Sure.
And also there's a way of reading face shapes and even hands and getting some clues when you don't know somebody. So it's really about the initiation of understanding somebody when you don't know them. It's a bit like visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. You want to make the best connection, and then you can introduce your own style and start tuning in and create this bridge. Right. Because once you then create the bridge, you get to that harmonious place of saying, hey, we get on so well together, even though we're so different.
And that's just, well, you know, I know, I'm sure our guests know, when you have those moments, it's like, yeah, right. It just settles and it's desirable and it feels warm and happy, and not just happy, it feels joyful.
It feels joyful. And I tell you what, in my experience, so this is where it's fun, is that many of the best partnerships, both intimate and in any sexual preference or in business or whatever, are complements. So they're not actually the same. It's the kind of yin and yang practice is that we need the masculine and feminine in whatever combination of biologies. And we often find that that is the fusion and the synergy that creates some of the best entities enterprises, businesses, families.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And they recognize that complementary state
Yes.
and allow the other one, to be who they are, and
Yeah.
then to reflect who they are from themselves.
Yes.
And the other does the same.
Yes.
Now,
And
are
and
there
that's
any?
that's where, sorry, that's where I think the joy of being an individual and understanding we're equal and different is it's just so magical, because we can be the same, we can be similar, but obviously valuing the differences can make the energy that makes our whole world work.
Mm-hmm.
That's really the magic key for me.
And a wonderful magic key that is. In the development of your understanding, were there particular people or practices or systems that you found to be most helpful or most insightful in your own development?
In a sense of learning modules, do you mean, or just ways of doing things?
Ways of doing things that, and when you're looking, because I know for me, when I was younger, I was looking at all kinds of different people, systems, places, theories, and distilling them all into what felt true for me. And then building on that skill set as far as the practical application and honing the skills, so to speak, right? So were there those things for you? Were there, was there a particular person, and I'm thinking audience-wise, right? So that if they choose to go follow up on some of the insights and understanding that you're sharing into how you got it so that they can understand it better, what was that?
But
where might you lead them?
I studied human behavior, but what was interesting is in my return to business, having stopped for a bit to have my kids, I became an image consultant. And what that taught me was the nature of our physicality reflects the world that suits us best. So your coloring, your shape, your style. And I wasn't an image consultant from a fashion point of view. In fact, I was, even though I was president of the International Federation of Image Consultants in the UK.
So is my image consistent with the motif of the?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, good. I just thought, as long as you're here, I thought I'd ask the question, right?
But what I discovered was that our field of vibration to the colors and the shapes and the scales that we like come from our body. Mm-hmm. And I hadn't realized that. And that was my greatest study. And as I was studying human behavior, I was looking at physicality, and I was thinking, that's really interesting. The women who are similar shape to me seem to be more masculine minded and be business students or working in very male sectors. And the women who are more female shaped, I mean, I was a female, but I wasn't that sort of softer shape. And it was the same with men. And I thought, that's really interesting. So I'm a bit of a sort of analytical person, and I like geometry. So I was using my own experiences to notice difference to help me in the first place, because I thought, why am I different to some of those women that I thought I was the same as? And then I realized the behavioral traits came into it, and also with men. And then I worked a lot with Gestalt theory and a little bit of NLP, but I worked with other people who were really masters at understanding cognitive behavior. And I come from a very common sense route of educating myself. I can think, does that work or does that not work?
Common sense and critical thinking today is kind of the national deficit, isn't it?
Well, that's right. And one of the key bits that came to me was the philosophy of value creation, which I learned from, it's a Japanese educationalist called Terasubuno Makiguchi. And he was alive in the sort of the century before last. So he passed in sort of 1946, I think.
Okay.
And he was promoting the idea that in education, you needed to ask the child what their natural gift was and how they could express it, and really expand from that, as opposed to teaching them rote education, which of course in Japan at the time.
I'm totally in agreement with that.
And his system was that the value creation came from value yourself in order to value your relationships, in order to value the whole. So it's a very Buddhist principle, but it was something I hadn't put into that cycle. And this was in my 40s that I came across this, and I thought, oh, that makes really sense, because it means I take responsibility for what happens to me. I don't externalize it. So that philosophy really drove my understanding of, once I found out about myself, that was one journey, but understanding how it related to creating value for the world,
Mm-hmm.
it had to start with my value and sharing it. And that's where the circle comes, and the wisdom circles and the magical conversations all came from that base philosophy. And for me, what the understanding was that we're not all at the same level, but we've all got that cycle.
Right. That kind of reminds me of the strengths movement.
Yeah.
Right. And very similar things. In the awareness of that, how do you see the acknowledgement of the differences in others, and how that comes into the conversations, and how it's revealed in the unification of the team, so to speak?
I think the main thing is understanding that we're equal and different. I'll go back to that, because I remember when I was a kid, I was really good at maths, but I was really bad at language. And I would always doubt myself, because my sister was very good at language, and yet I was very good at maths. I didn't applaud myself. And then I got very worried that I didn't know things. And I think I must be stupid, so I'll just keep quiet. And then I realized that great lesson of life, when you realize what you don't know is wonderful, because you can ask somebody about it, and you can actually say, I don't know that. That's fascinating. And also, you don't need to know everything.
Now, the interesting thing in business, that old school, right, or last century, people couldn't admit they didn't know. They would just BS their way through stuff, and yet the powerful ones were the one that could say, I don't know, let me think about that, or let me go get an answer for you.
Well, that's right. And one of my visions for business is that with the synergy of men and women coming together who truly understand their empowerment together, not taking over from each other, is that we understand that there are different types of men, different types of women, that everything is valuable. So that you could actually put on the P&L a sort of profit line for intuition. So you might have logic and intuition equally valuable. Whereas I don't think that happens at the moment, because you've still got the corporate world who goes, yeah, that intuition stuff. Okay.
Everything's still data driven. There's no gut feelings. Well, I can't say that there's no, because I believe that there are those subtle magical masters that can intuit and back it into the data.
That's right. And I think that's the shift, that we got to hold on to data. I love data, but you can't have data without flow. And I mean, it's like accountancy. You can be very creative with accountancy. You can be very creative with science. You know, you can't, in the world of women of Amdan, you can't be exclusive. We see it all rolling in together. And when we shift into that magical synergy as the river comes together, then intuition and logic can flow together. It's a bit like the Vulcan on Star Trek, who says logic is the only way forward.
Right.
But actually, you know, his colleague who's very emotional says, no, I'm gonna find that emotion in you. I always say, you know, I believe every human being has emotions, otherwise we wouldn't be living. So we just got to find out how to express them so that somebody else can understand.
So that it works.
Yeah.
Right. Now, and one of the, speaking of work and the preparation to do so, you mentioned education and the kids or the Japanese gentleman that came up with the idea that we really don't assess or understand the natural gifts, and I taught high school for a number of years in multiple environments, inner city, charter, regular ed, exceptional student, special ed, learning handicapped and emotionally, or learning disabled, emotionally handicapped, and residential treatment center. Now, I saw a lot of things that were missing. So one of the things I did for my degree in organizational management was I wrote a business plan for model school. And the whole concept started with the initial assessment of the natural aptitudes of the kids.
Yes.
And you can't, you've got to establish where they are, what they're like. And we try to push all this stuff and put them in a box and, you read and repeat, right? That's the ineffective wash cycle, right? So
I know the colors run.
right. And they just get all dried out after a while because he's sitting, anyway, too many metaphors. The coming of this new regenerative culture and the idea of creating things that are much more harmonious and earth-based and nature-based and human, ergonomically based, right?
Yeah.
This seems to be a critical factor in developing new educational systems.
Yes.
Do you see any reflection of that in the conversations that you're having around the world?
Definitely, because one of the things that my husband and I run is the International University of Entrepreneurology. And this is about the education portal, which is what this Japanese educator talked about, Sir Ken Robinson did. It's about creativity. You're an entrepreneurologist. You think outside of the box. You think beyond the basic.
What box?
And that's what I see happening. And even in very traditional environments where we lived in Malaysia for 4 years, where they're very traditional about universities, even so, we would find very enlightened vice chancellors who would say, yeah, actually, we need to do that. And one who said, I think traditional universities will disappear in the next 10 years. And now with COVID, I see that happening, is that there's a big desire to do things differently. But like everything, the old systems need to break down as we bridge this divide and go forward. And
I surmise that it will be a natural process as we move forward, because we'll learn, in my opinion, I could be wrong, we learn how and where to put our attention, intention, and interaction, and we don't distract ourselves and muddy the water with other stuff that doesn't need to be there.
Well, I think the big change is going to happen because the kids are going to say, I don't want that old stuff.
Well, they already are. Look at Greta, what's her last name? Thunberg? Or,
yeah.
Right?
I mean, with 2 years out of, COVID blocking a lot of education, but people going home and homeschooling and everything, there's a huge shift. My grandchildren who are 11 and 13, yes, they were at a traditional school, but I don't see them wanting to do what we might have done in the past, because the options are different. They're free thinking.
Hugely different.
Yeah.
There's, the shift in remote working, the invitation for remote working.
Yeah.
Right. There were very few that had done that. Now with COVID, everybody could anyway convert their workforce to remote workers. Now,
and we know
that, bring them back.
We know that there are kids who are even 4, 5, 6 who are thinking up ideas, and adults helping them to put their business together. We've got one of our PhDs in Kuala Lumpur who has an amazing school. She wants us to put entrepreneurology education into her kids so that by the time they're 14, 15, they already have all that mindset and mind flow and equipment to start their own business. So why would they go to college?
So those are things, I teach marketing at the university level, and these are some of the things in looking for and identifying this new, not just the target market, but the way in which to engage it.
Yes. Yes. And I've actually had a call from an educationalist here who wants me to put a magical communication program into schools for 10 to 18-year-olds. I mean, that'd be great.
Well, and it kind of, there are a number of schools that have junior and senior programs that are college prep that are coordinated with the local community colleges to get credit and take it that step further. And some of them are even getting their associate degrees and moving on, right? Which is really cool. You know, education, I believe in it because it's necessary, yet the way that we've been using it has almost been contrary to what it was actually intended to do.
Well, that's right. I mean, the natural process of wanting to learn, the desire to discover, explore,
Right.
That's all education. What we have to do is to value all these things in different ways. Going back to your question, how do we bring these conversations together? We have to come to some agreement that compassion, integrity, intuition, gut instinct, these are all valuable things alongside the somewhat more traditional aspects of business, for instance. And women, and I'm not saying women only, but women have brought a difference into the business world. I've always said one of the things that women have brought to the world is that they bring life into business because they can't leave their commitment to their family at home. I know they might leave their children at home, but their mind is still there.
Well, they don't compartmentalize. Men traditionally compartmentalize, so they can, and they're taught to leave work at work, home at home. And we practiced that for a long time and realized, oh, that really doesn't work because our minds are, they're one mind and there's no separation in that. So these things begin to crop in and affect our work and our home, depending on, you know, where the issues exist, right? Because they spill over. We're the same person, and like T. Harv Eker says, you know, what you do anywhere, you do everywhere, right? So we're just now, it's like, oh, duh, gosh, that seems like it makes sense. So how can we
common sense?
Yeah, exactly. And so we make sense common, and that's kind of one of my jobs, I think. Or I feel that in that coming together and moving forward, are there some specific simple ideas and notions that you can advise others to test in their own lives, to try out, see how it works for them, and something that would maybe give a more demonstrable or demonstrable result by the practice?
Yes, I think one of the key things, because my main study is about different types of men or women, is understanding the key difference, as you pointed out, that, you know, men generally are more compartmentalized, so women are more multifaceted and circular. So as women, take yourself into work, be that multifaceted person, not try to be like a man. And for men to allow women to have the space to express their ideas without shutting them down too quickly. And then between women and men between men is just to recognize how much are you in your head and how much are in your heart. Now, you know, I know that from my own experience. I'm quite a masculine-minded woman, so I've got all the female attributes, but I like being in my logic. And I think, you know, I found myself saying once, I think I feel. And I stopped myself and I said, I just said, I think I feel. And so it's, where do you go to under pressure?
Well, longest journey is 18 inches, right? And somewhere you got to meet in the middle.
And one of the keys is that if you're more masculine energy as a woman or a man, you would tend to go outward in your frustration. So it's like, oh, I've got to just go and do it. Whereas the feminine energy will go inwards and say, oh, I don't know about that. Let me find out.
Right.
But our reactive process is what is important. When we're aware, we can still have a reactive moment where we go, oh, I just spotted that. So be okay with the other party who is different to you. And if you see a difference and you don't understand it, explore.
Yeah, ask
You might
questions.
actually say to somebody, do you know, you're quite different to me. Can we look at the observations about how different we are as women?
Now, how do you, because there is in that questioning, right? I find that questions often seem like or perceived as attacks,
Well, that's right.
right?
And
How do you get beyond that? First of all, is that, or do you find that to be true as well? And then how can one mitigate the perception of being attacked?
well, I think it does happen. I mean, everything we say is 99% likely to be misinterpreted by anybody else. So taking that places.
Unfortunately, that's probably true, right?
Explore, you know, if somebody's different and I want to find out, say, you know, I really observed that as, you know, say we're two women, is, you know, I did this recently with her. I said, you know, I just observed that we're so different. And I know this is how I see myself. Let's explore what that is. So you're placing it into that magical conversation of there's no judgment here. It's an exploration because we're both women. Or it could be with a man is that, well, you know, men and women are different. Oh, yes. So let's explore what those differences are, because this is the way I see this. And I'd love to know how you perceive that.
Right.
And then be willing to listen and use words like, may I ask you, is it okay if, I mean, it's very simple stuff. Then it's like,
and it's different than why are you this, you know, why do you do, you know, because that then kind of puts makes it feel like an aggression.
well, that's
because
right.
you feel like you're judged.
Yes.
Now you have to defeat, you're on the defensive, right? Which is a natural feeling because you're feeling like, okay, I'm feeling like I need to defend myself. That's not necessarily the case, but we don't necessarily know how to ask those questions to diffuse that response or that reaction.
Yes. Well, I think it's just important to slow down the process. What I usually say is that differences not understood turn out to be difficult. Now, if you ask a general audience of 100 people, and I've done this many a times, how many of you are difficult? You'll probably get 2 or 3 brave souls who put their hand up. I have to say, in an American audience, you'll get more, and a British audience, you'll get less.
Yeah, well,
then you ask,
I'd be one of the first. I know I'm difficult, right?
Then you ask the whole lot, how many of you know a difficult person? Every single hand goes up. So I say, okay, that's interesting, isn't it? We've got 5 difficult people here out of 100, and 100 of you know a difficult person. So actually the difficulty is not in the other person. The difficulty is in the situation of misunderstanding.
Exactly. Or so within oneself, because in the misunderstanding, lack of perception, or mispositioned perception.
Yes, and the other thing I would suggest to people is avoid saying, I'm right, you're wrong, because that's
a death knell.
That's a death knell. And that's actually what I would call an energy vampire.
Yeah.
And an energy vampire can be anything from saying to your partner, are you really going to go out dressed like that? To something really vicious. They all can have an effect on that person that is detrimental.
Diminishing. And so anytime that, and oftentimes we don't necessarily, and I'm saying personally, I do this too, because I don't always, my intentions are not to be diminishing.
Yes.
And yet invariably I'll say something, especially my wife, that she perceives as being diminishing. And I in no way, shape, or form intend it to be that way. So, and I think, you know, in relationships, we all have that challenge because we want to just speak our mind and not necessarily filter how it's going to be heard, right? Or thinking about the receiver before we say something. We just spout it out and expect it to be accepted in the way we intend it. And like you were talking about earlier, the misconception, the miscommunication that takes place as a result.
I think so. And I mean, I think one of the challenges, and I've come across it recently, is like somebody who's saying something that feels detrimental to you, and they're saying, but I need to express how I feel, that's when you come in with that very calm statement of, well, it's a really interesting point of view. It's not mine, but I honor that it's yours. And then you have a decision as to whether you want to stay in that space or move away.
Right. And you make a good point in the finding space.
Yes.
When you don't react and you know self-awareness, right? Where you recognize, okay, I need to do it. It's like, I need to pull this file and respond this way, right?
Yes.
It's a pause button where you pause, reflect, and then offer in a better place.
Yes.
And how is there something that we can practice on a regular basis that assists us to reprogram those pattern behaviors?
Oh, yes. And I think, you know, as the behavioral scientists say, it takes at least 21 days or 7 months, or basically it takes quite a time to change a habit. But part of that is other people recognizing the habit that you've changed and owning it. So I have an acronym which is CORE, which is choice, ownership, responsibility, creates energy. So when you make a choice, say, you know, something simple like you change your hairstyle, but it's very, very different. So people going, oh, why have you done that? Or you create a new image for yourself, and friends are a bit uncomfortable. Help them to understand that you've taken ownership. So you might say, well, I know that might seem a bit of a shock for you, but I really like this. I hope you get used to it. And after 7 or 8 times, 7 weeks, 7 months,
Right.
whatever it is, people are saying, oh, you've always been like that.
I'd almost offer the 20th century was could be nicknamed our codependent century.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And that now we're working towards interdependence.
Interdependence, absolutely. And that's where I think one fascinating conversation is actually the word collaboration, because it's become very commonplace now. And I think if you put all the different characters on my map around the table and you ask them for an explanation of collaboration, you would get different commentary. And can we listen to that? That's the challenge.
And can we find the commonality within those various expressions so that it makes it easier for
Yes.
everyone to buy in to that collective?
Yes. And that is key to the responsibility piece, because you're taking responsibility for your own acts, but I don't believe we should take responsibility for acts that will give damage to somebody else. You can still be yourself and share your opinion or your experience. If you preface it, you say, well, this is my view and my view alone.
Right.
And I expect you to have a different view. So let's explore where these create the river of truth together between us.
It's funny how, and I totally agree with this, but yet this is another aspect we have to be aware of. Is like, okay, now I need to preface what I'm going to say so that others are aware that this is just my opinion, me speaking, or even if you have facts that you're backing it up with, right? But we haven't been in a habit, again, the habits, right?
Yeah.
Of doing, and it's not just a hat, although it's very nunnery. It can be this really almost a consternation of how, or reticence is like, oh my God, I got to do this again. You know, why do I have to waste my time in order to preface what I say? Can't these idiots just hear me for what I'm talking about? You know, these are the thoughts that go through our heads, and I'm sure you agree. I know you probably have them too.
I do.
Yeah, and those aren't the ones that we need to allow to control our behavior. Just the opposite. We need to, again, acknowledge that, yeah, this is just me ranting in the moment. However, I'm not really that way. I'm going to choose to be this way, which is more congruent in how I think, feel, and believe.
Yes. So it's that tricky balance between being who you are and owning it, and understanding you feel very different to somebody else, where the two differences meet.
Right.
And it's like, is it that kind of meeting, that balanced kind of meeting, or
Sure.
is it butting up against somebody? Because if you keep on butting up against somebody, then you need to listen to the vibration and say, is this what I need in order to progress? And does it enhance the other person? What can I do to make it different? Yeah, I'm a great follower of Simon Sinek, and he alludes to
I love him too. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's following that remit is, what is the message behind somebody's anguish or anger or distress? You don't have to be a therapist, but you might ask, in my observation of you, something is happening there. Is there anything you want to share? If the person says no, then don't.
And don't take it on about being about you.
Yeah.
Right? Because this is their stuff. All you're doing is you're being caring and compassionate, concerned for them, and wanting to, or at least in my opinion, this is what most people like us do. We really want to be there to help.
But there is something maybe to kind of bring this to thing, is holding the space for somebody.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know whether you ever met or came across Richard Bandler. Richard Bandler was one of the original NLP masters.
Okay, yeah, I knew that name sounded familiar. There's so many.
Yes.
What file do I need to draw on that one?
Well, what was interesting is, I believe the story was that he partnered with somebody who was very, if you like, left-brained. He was very right-brained, but he was very into frequencies and vibrations. And I went on one of his programs, and it was about he said, just be there in the space. You might be sitting opposite a client and they're rather terse or they're stressed, and just literally hold the space with a kind of lovely smile and a space of energy, send the energy forward, allow them maybe have their little rant, and then be very calm about just vibrating at your energy in order to bring them into it. And I tested it out after the weekend with a rather terse client who said, whoa, 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 whoa. So what are you going to do for me? And I suddenly said at this space, I said, I think I'd like to take your wonderful energy and make it even better. And he just went, oh, okay, let's resign on the bottom line.
Right. Wonderful.
And I wouldn't normally have done that. I would probably have, in another case, sort of thought, oh, what am I going to do with this guy? But actually, I recognized his fear was, why am I?
The fear converts to vibrato.
Yeah. And I think if we can be just aware of energy, and a lot of people don't know what that means, but if you take them into that space, so when do you feel energetic? Maybe it's when you're walking the dog, or you're singing a song, or you get the proposal right. Okay, let's take that energy, and take that memory and put it into action with a difficult meeting that you go into.
Sure.
How did you use it? So there's lots of different methods. It's what I call experiential.
Sure. I use the same type of thing. That's a file, right? Because I see things as kind of this, biocosmic computer, right?
Yeah.
We're all tapped into, and there's files everywhere that we can access. We just need to know the key code, right? Or the file extension. This being one of those file extensions that once you have an experience, a feeling, a sensation, it's logged. And all you got to do is go back to that, feel it, and bring it, and consciously pull it into the current moment.
Yes.
And recognize that, yeah, you can do that. It is possible.
It's like bringing the orchestra together. You need the string section and the drums and the what do you call it,
the woodwinds and the stringed instruments and the brass and
it may be that you only play a tiny bit of the whole piece, but everybody's important.
Yeah, very much so. And as I've been a progressive rock drummer for decades, and so I understand that implicitly.
Yeah.
Wow. We could talk forever.
We could.
And I really appreciate you and the information that you've given, the processes, the ideas, the insights, the opportunities for others to engage life in a different way that might create a magical presence for them. And someday we'll understand that magic as science.
Absolutely.
Right? So I really appreciate what you've offered, and I'm sure our audience has too. And I look forward to continued evolution together, Pauline.
Absolutely. And anybody who wants to join the Magical Conversation Wisdom Circle, where we're creating the future together, that's building that narrative, building the compendium, then come along and join us.
Great. And I'll make sure that there's a link in the description. Great. Thank you again. And namaste and in la catch. Thank you for being with us for this episode of One World in a New World. I'm Zen Benefiel, your host, and I'll see you next time.